Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
What if everything we think we know about life, about time, space, and even our place in the universe is merely scratching the surface? Imagine that our search for extraterrestrial life isn't just about finding others, but also about understanding ourselves. What if the way we explore the stars mirrors how we need to evolve right here on Earth? Welcome back to Superhumanize, the space where we journey deep into the intersections of wellness, science, philosophy, and human potential. Today's conversation is with someone who stands at the very edge of those frontiers, Dr. Adam Frank, an astrophysicist, author, and thought leader who has dedicated his career to understanding both the cosmos and our place within it. Adam isn't just about stars and galaxies. He's also a bridge between worlds, between science and spirituality, technology and tradition, and humanity's distant past and possible futures. He explores the birth and death of stars and also the potential rise and fall of civilizations, both here on Earth and beyond. His work on Technosignatures, the clues left behind by advanced alien civilizations, forces us to ask, how do we know what we are even looking for? And perhaps more importantly, what would finding something out there mean for the way we live down here? In his book, Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds and the Fate of the Earth, Adam weaves together the quest for alien life with the urgent need for planetary stewardship during the Anthropocene. His latest work, The Little Book of Aliens, offers an exploration of humanity's deep fascination with extraterrestrials and why these narratives matter as much for our culture as for science. During today's conversation, we'll explore the scientific and cultural dimensions of the search for extraterrestrial life, the lessons we can learn from modeling the rise and fall of potential alien civilizations, and what the nature of time means for how we live and evolve as individuals and societies. We'll also talk about the fascinating intersection between science and spirituality, a recurring theme in Adam's life and work. As someone who has contributed to media like the New York Times, The Atlantic, and NPR, as well as serving as a consultant for one of my all-time favorite movies, Marvel's Doctor Strange, Adam has a unique perspective on how popular culture shapes the public's understanding of science and why storytelling is a vital tool in inspiring humanity to reach its highest potential. This conversation will challenge you, inspire you, and hopefully make you look at the sky and yourself a little differently. Adam, welcome to the Superhumanize podcast. I am seriously so excited to talk to you because your body of work, your expertise touches upon some of my absolute favorite topics: consciousness, time, exploring space, extraterrestrials. I love your background. You just disclosed to me that it's the old Enterprise. My background, of course, is looking back at Mother Earth, and I just shared with you, I am the proud owner of a Fox Mulder bobblehead. My ringtone for many years used to be the score of X-Files. So again, I am so happy we connect. Welcome to the Superhumanized podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Me too, Adam. Some of the work that you've done is truly fascinating. For example, your absolutely pioneering work on Technosignatures has opened up new avenues into the search for extraterrestrial civilizations, which is shifting the focus from the more traditional SETI approaches to more subtle technological indicators. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and also what kind of recent advancements in detecting technosignatures you are most excited about currently?
Sure. There's SETI. People have all heard about SETI, which is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And that we associate with big radio telescopes. And if anybody's seen the movie Contact, Jodie Foster with her headphones on, listening for signals that somebody beamed us a message or a cure for cancer or something. And that is very much the old way of doing things. And it's the old way of doing things because when that method was developed in the early, or the 1960s really, we didn't have any other ways of thinking about how to find alien civilizations. because we didn't know whether there were any planets out there. Literally, people were just pointing their telescopes at stars and hoping for the best, not knowing anything about whether or not there were planets orbiting those stars. We did not know until 1996 whether there were any planets orbiting other stars at all. It could be that planets were very rare. Our solar system was a 1 in a zillion shot. And it could be that there were no planets, in which case life would have been, because we think you need planets to make life. So what happened in 1995, 96 was the beginning, our first exoplanets, as we call them. We started to discover planets orbiting other stars. And then within 10 years, we realized that every star in the sky has planets orbiting it. And that means now we know exactly where to look. So if we're looking for life of any kind, whether it's dumb life or smart life, biospheres or what we call technospheres, then now we know exactly where to look. And that's been the major revolution. Rather than SETI, many of us now call it Technosphere, Technosignatures. What we're looking for, because even the idea of intelligence, it's hard to define exactly what you mean by intelligence. But technology is basically anything which a biosphere, which nature on its own is not going to produce. Technology is an industrial or a manufacturing process. So technosignatures are signatures in the light that we would get from an exoplanet, from a distant planet orbiting a distant star, that would have some indication in it that there was a technology being produced on that planet. So biosignatures are signatures of just life, of a biosphere. Technosignatures are signatures of a technosphere. And by sphere, what we always mean is that when the Earth has been enveloped by life for the last 3.5 billion years. Life is so potent that it has changed the planet. Like the sum total of life, which is what we mean by the biosphere, has changed the planet and changed how the planet appears from a distance. A technosphere is the technological version of that. And we've had a technosphere for, say, 100 years, ever since we started, like the Industrial Revolution really cranked up over the last 150 years. So technosignatures are now the focus of looking for civilizations on other planets. And my job, my group and I, the group I'm part of, I'm the principal investigator on NASA's first grant to study potential technosignatures. And we've come up, that's our job. Our job is to articulate. We're not looking yet. We haven't gotten to the point to know what to look for. We're just articulating what might be a good idea to look for. So things like, for example, if a civilization used solar panels in mass, like if a civilization covered its version of the Sahara with solar panels to harvest energy, whether they were using our kind of solar panels or some other kind of solar panel, the reflected light, when the light hits a solar panel, some of it gets reflected back, that can be seen from 40 light years. That's a technosignature. Certain kinds of things in the atmosphere, certain kinds of chemicals that could only be produced by industry, that a biosphere isn't going to produce on its own. Things like chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. Those we found could be detected across 40 light years. We could look at a planet with a telescope and see in the light signatures that we're getting from that planet, we could see like the fingerprint, so to speak, the spectral fingerprint of chlorofluorocarbons. And then we could tell, oh my God, there's a civilization out there that's putting these chemicals into the atmosphere, either on purpose for maybe terraforming, for warming up their planet, or by accident. So those are just some examples. And this is a completely new field, completely revolutionary. And it's really exciting to see this field emerge year by year.
Yes, 100%. And it is mind-blowing what we're already capable to do. And as technology just grows and grows at a faster and faster pace, what are some things that you think we can deploy or that will be possible in the more nearer than farther future for actually detecting these technosignatures?
Yeah, that's what's really remarkable. This is really all the story of advances in telescope technology, right? We found planets. The only reason we found planets in 1995 was because we had developed more powerful instruments that we could hang on a telescope to be able to see the light, be able to distinguish the light from a planet from its star, right? The stars are bright, planets are dim. Stars are big, planets are small, right? So the analogy, let's just stick with the technology needed to even find a planet. The analogy people use is finding an exoplanet orbiting a star is the same thing as looking from New York City to San Francisco and being able to see a moth flitting around one of the Klieg lights or one of the stadium lights at Giants Field.
Mhm.
It's called Citi Field. I'm not really sure what it's called. No, Citi Field is the Mets. Excuse me. I'm a Mets fan. I'm not sure what the baseball field in San Francisco is called. But that's basically the idea. You'd have to have technology that could see a moth just moving around one of those giant lights. That's what it's like trying to find an exoplanet. In 1995, we figured out how to do that. Yay! And that's how we found all of these exoplanets. Now what we want to do is we want to be able to look at the light from that exoplanet and be able to pull it apart so that we can see the signature in there, the dips and the wiggles that come from having chlorofluorocarbons in it or come from having city lights. Like one thing we could see, we think, is if a planet had a lot of cities on it and had artificial illumination like our cities does, we should be able to see that from a distance. But it requires really powerful instruments. Right now, we can't do that. But in the next 10, 20, 30 years, what I say in the book, in the little book of aliens, what I say is that in the next couple of decades, we are going to have the instrumentation that we're going to have either on giant ground-based telescopes on the ground on mountains that are literally a football field across. Like the telescope itself is going to be a football field wide. Or the things that we're putting into space. So the James Webb Space Telescope that we have up there now, if we were lucky, maybe we'd be able to see a technosignature. But the next big space telescope that we're going to put up there probably in 20 years is called the Habitable Worlds Observatory. And the name tells you everything. It's being designed to find signatures of life on habitable worlds. And that one, there the technology is really going to be tuned to finding bio and techno signatures. Within the next 10, 20, 30 years, we will have data for the first time that's going to be relevant to the question of are we alone in the universe? And that's never happened before. That's really the change. I can't tell you what it's going to say. It may say, look, we've looked at 20 planets, 30 planets, 100 planets. We haven't found anything. That's going to tell us something, right? Or we're going to be like, oh my God, a biosignature or a technosignature. We're not alone. One way or the other, we're going to have that data soon.
Yes, and that is super exciting. With regard to technosignatures, how high is the risk of misinterpreting potentially just natural phenomena?
Yeah, that's it. That we call those false positives. And that is huge, actually. And so there's it's so interesting watching a new science be born. Because first everyone's, yay, we could do this. It's going to be great. And then we're like, oh, wait a minute. This isn't going to work. And then other people are like, no, it can work. So there's this back and forth. So we've recognized now as the field is maturing that we're going to have to be aware of false positives. Like when we get a signal, we see a big spike in the light that we think is a technosignature. We're going to have to be aware of all the ways we could fool ourselves, right? And that's the big difference, because I'm sure we're going to come to this, between the science of technosignatures and what happens with UFOs, right? Is that with UFOs, people are like, anything they've seen is like evidence of aliens on Earth. Whereas with science, you have to make 100% sure in 100 different ways that not only did you get a signal, but you understand the signal, you understand how you analyze the signal, and you're not fooling yourself into thinking that signal is something else other than what you want to claim it to be. So a lot of the work that we're doing, and in our group, we've written a couple of papers and we're ready to write a couple more about how to make sure that the signal you got, is actually what you think it is. If you think you found evidence of alien technology, how can you be sure it's not trees, right? Which would still be amazing. If you found alien trees on another planet, if you found a biosignature, that would still be amazing. It wouldn't be what you wanted, which is you thought alien technology. Or how can you be sure it's not volcanoes, right? That you're just being fooled into thinking that this technology is a signal of technology is actually a signal of super volcanoes on an alien planet. So you got to do a lot of work, a lot of clear thinking, a lot of thinking about the probability and statistics and the geophysics and all kinds of things to be able to evaluate that. But that's the good work of good science. We're doing that now so that by the time we're ready to really start looking with telescopes in the next 10, 20 years, we'll be ready to also know whether or not we're being fooled by the signals we find with those telescopes.
Yes, indeed, Adam. And talking about some of, because this certainly is a challenge that will get tackled, what are some of the other most significant technological challenges that we're still facing in the search for extraterrestrial life? And how may we overcome those in the near future?
Yeah, again, it's pretty much, I was going to say it's all technology, but actually there's a lot of theory as well that we have to work out. So for example, when we think about, even let's just think about biosignatures for a minute before we get to technology, right? We want to make sure that we have found, say, a signal of an alien biosphere. For an example, one of these that we think the clearest one that people have been talking around forever is oxygen. If we looked at a planet, and we can tell what's in the atmosphere. That's the great thing. We can characterize the atmosphere. And we found oxygen in their atmosphere. That would be a very strong indicator that there was a biosphere there. Why? Because the only reason we have oxygen in our atmosphere is because of life. So when the Earth, for the first billion years of Earth's life, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. And the only reason we have oxygen is because somewhere around a billion years after the Earth formed, so the Earth's been around 4.5 billion years. Life formed about a billion years afterwards. So that's 3.5 billion years ago. And then about a billion years after life formed, evolution invented a new kind of photosynthesis, basically, a new way of harvesting, getting energy from light. And this kind of photosynthesis, when it used water as a substrate, used water as the basic material, and it would break the water molecule apart, eat the hydrogen to make sugar, to make energy, and then it farted out the oxygen. It just spewed the oxygen back into the environment. And it took a while, but that filled the entire atmosphere with oxygen. So the only reason we've got breathable oxygen is because of these microbes 2.5 billion years ago inventing this new kind of photosynthesis. So we think that if you found oxygen in the atmosphere of an alien world, that would be a biosignature. That would be a clear indication that there was life there. Now, again, false positives. We could be wrong in a bunch of different ways because we do know of some ways that a planet on its own without life, could make oxygen. And so that's why when you're asking about the challenges, we have to really think deeply about how planets evolved, all the different ways that planets can evolve, where, for example, you could just naturally get oxygen into the atmosphere. So there's a theory part of this too. One part's technology, building ever larger telescopes, getting larger telescopes into space. That's a huge challenge. But there's also the theory part of it, of figuring out, okay, Earth did this, Earth evolved this way, but let's say Earth was like twice as large. How would things be different, right? How would like the interior of the Earth, with the magma and all the other stuff that goes on, how might that change what got belched into the atmosphere via volcanoes? So it's both having to think really clearly about how planets evolve, how they change over time, which is super cool, as well as figuring out how can we get a 500-ton telescope into orbit around the moon so we can take new pictures.
Yes, lots and lots of things to think about, and even the variables on what you just shared. What if it was double the size? What if it was a third the size, 5 times the size, et cetera, et cetera? It sounds maddening, all the things you need to keep in mind. That being said, I have always found that it is one of the most important questions, in my humble opinion, of humanity. Are we alone? Where do we come from, etc.? And the discovery of extraterrestrial life would be one of the most profound moments in human history, as we know it, reshaping not just science, but culture and philosophy, reshaping societies. What do you think, Adam, the immediate cultural and societal reactions would be to discovering extraterrestrial life? And how should we prepare for that possibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad we share the same opinion in this way. Because when people think about discovering life in the universe, usually we do it through our science fiction shows where somebody lands and either wants to mate with us or eat us or enslave us. So obviously that would have a huge impact. But people sometimes think, look, if we just found evidence of a through telescopes, what would it matter? And I think that's the very wrong way of thinking about it. Because, what I'll point to is this little thing called the Copernican revolution, right? If you go back 500 years and you ask your average person on the planet, oh, look, the sun's coming up. What's going on there? They'd be like, oh, the sun's coming up because the Earth is the center of the universe and the sun goes around the Earth. Everybody knows that. And then in 1500 or so, Copernicus came along, or his book was published, which said the Earth is not the center of the universe. The sun is actually the center of the solar system, and the Earth is just another planet going around the sun. You got Mercury, you got Venus. Earth is just one of those planets. And that's what we call the Copernican revolution. Then by 1600, people were like, they saw the sun coming up. They're like, oh no, that's not the sun coming up. That's the horizon rolling down because the Earth is rotating and it's revolving around the sun. Now that little thing called the Copernican revolution, you think, it's just astronomy, who cares? It was actually fundamental to all the changes that were happening in European civilization at the time. The Renaissance, which would eventually lead to the Enlightenment, it actually figured in the Protestant Reformation, which kind of had a huge impact. And in just the way people were reimagining what humanity was and how it should organize itself. So things like the birth of industrial capitalist economies, really the Copernican revolution is foundational for that. This, what would seemingly be just something in astronomy, is the sun the center or the universe or not, who cares, actually figured in the most profound change in human history of how we organize ourselves, and recognizing that we were not alone, that our life, not just human beings, but the life on Earth, was not a one-off, was not an accident, would be equally profound. Because what it would show us is that this thing called life, right? This crazy little thing called life. One thing, let me just step back for a moment and just talk about that. Life is not like any other thing in the universe that we know about, right? So you got rocks, you got comets, you got stars. All of those things, they're amazing, but they're not nearly as amazing as life. And what I mean by that is that if you gave me a star, if you said, here's a star, it's just starting its life, what's going to happen in 5 billion years? I could pretty much tell you almost everything. The star is not going to surprise me. Its evolution is going to be determined. If you gave me a cell and asked me, what is that going to happen to that cell in 4 billion years? I would never be able to predict a giant rabbit that punched you in the face, right? So life invents, life creates, life exceeds itself. And as we know right now, we're the only example of it in the entire universe. But if there's just one other example, if it's happened one other time, then it's happened lots of other times. And that would mean that we're part of a community of life. And that who knows how far life has gone? Who knows what limits life has broken through, and we're part of that. And that, I think, would force us to really reevaluate how we view ourselves, how we view life, the sacredness of life, the need to cherish life. And then, of course, things like religions and all of that would have to adapt to the fact, we're not the only time in the universe that life is formed. And it's probably quite common.
And is what in the prevalent monotheistic religions of the world currently, what is called God, is that actually what our concept of God implies? Or do we call beings God that may have had something to do with our creation or evolution, but they're not actually what we mean when we say God? Lots of interesting questions.
Lots of interesting questions for theologists. Yeah.
I want to share something with you. My father, it's very interesting. So I had known this man all of my life. And about 15 years ago, for the first time, we had a serious conversation about human life, extraterrestrials, etc. And just to give you a little bit of background, he is a long retired now, but a career diplomat, ambassador for Germany. And if you would have central casting, cast a German diplomat ambassador, that will be my dad, right? So very straightforward, also very science-based, not even religious. And so 15 years ago, the conversation came up and he shared with me a story when it was 1964. He was working in Latin America, in Quito, to be specific. And that particular evening, he was walking up a hill to pick up a work colleague, and it was the beginning of the evening. He hadn't touched a glass of wine yet, and a starlit sky above him. And all of a sudden, he saw this craft in the sky, quite close, multiple lights, I think rotating. I got to go back. I actually filmed him last year retelling the story just to have it on. And it moved at angles that he just couldn't explain to himself. Everything that he knew about technology at the time, how was that possible? So he observed this craft for about 10 minutes or so, and at which point the craft took off at incredible speed, just back into space. And it was actually my mom, as I was taping my dad last year, filming him, where she asked, "Did you ever share that with anyone?" He's no. As in, of course he did. And she's like, "Why?" And I was like, "Good question, Mom." And he said, "Yeah, everybody would have thought something was wrong with me." So for me, I've heard that story from my father. My fascination has just grown. I've been fascinated with it since I was a child. But to hear a human being who's never shared a story, who's not the type of person to to talk about stuff like that at all, that was also a turning point for me. And I've heard other people talk about similar experiences. Of course, I'm not as close to them as to my father, but it is truly an interesting time we're living in. And your exploration of the scientific search for extraterrestrial life is deeply intertwined with the cultural narrative and also with our imaginations. And why do you think, Adam, that this search for extraterrestrial life, for aliens, so to speak, why does it resonate so deeply across cultures and generations? And what does this reveal about our nature?
Yeah, so this is interesting about the idea of the UFO phenomena, which I am skeptical of. Like with your dad, I would say, I think we can get to this. I wasn't there. I have no idea what your dad. And that's why I always hear people are like, how do you explain this? I wasn't there. I don't know. I can't explain it. But what this speaks to is, and let's later on talk about what we understand about the actual UFO phenomena. But I think this general interest is ancient, right? So as I talk about in the book, that like people have been asking the question about are we alone? Or is there anything, are we the only place where life is born? For 2,500 years. And I'm sure we were interested in it before then, but the first place you can actually see it is with the ancient Greeks actually getting into arguments with each other about this question. And I think, first of all, it's because the sky is just fundamentally mysterious. If you're out under this, what the worst part about being a modern is that the sky's been robbed from us. Very few of us ever see the full night sky in the way that every human being saw every night for pretty much until maybe 100 years ago, before the invention of artificial illumination. And most of the time, the only time we ever get the experience of the full night sky is when we have to go out camping or something. And even then, like we're tired, we've been camping, hiking all day, and we just look up, we're like, wow, that's amazing. And then we go to bed. Whereas like in the old days, when you were walking from town back to your house and you had a good hour as you were walking to look up and see the Milky Way and see a couple of meteors flashing. And the night sky in its glory is profoundly mysterious. It just evokes that for us. It draws forth the sense of what can only be called sacredness. So I think that question of what is it? What are these distant and yet vibrant lights? What does it have to do with our own lives? It's built into us. And then as we entered into the scientific, people were always wondering, what are those stars, right? And as we entered into the scientific era, where now we had ways of asking those questions where we didn't have to rely on mythology or just stories, then we began to understand that they were like us. They were other suns, which may have other stars. And then recently, as I said, we discovered, oh my God, there's other planets. There are other planets. And it is just natural to ask, are we the only ones? And then also, human life is so weird. It's so full of suffering, full of joy and suffering, and it's finite. We know we're all going to end. It's going to end in disaster, right? With our own deaths, our own obliteration. That to ask, is there anybody else that has this experience that we're having? Does anybody, and you look at the world, it's a mess. And you have to ask, does anybody do better? Are there any civilizations that manage to not be such jerks to each other? That I think that question just comes so fundamentally to us, and it's so built into us that's why it has the power. That's why finding an answer to this question would have so much power. And then culturally, when it comes to the UFOs visiting us as aliens, that's a narrative that's built into, I think, there's a reason why there's almost a quasi-religious aspect of the UFO culture has this sort of, it's faith in some sense. For some people with UFOs, doesn't matter what proof you could offer that, no, those aren't actually alien spacecrafts, because there's a kind of faith that's built. That's about angels. That's about more, and there being more than us. So I think a lot of things come into, a lot of cultural heritage, cultural antecedents come into the modern feeling, the modern sense of the question of, is there life in the universe? And the way it also relates then, UFOs, are they here?
What I find really fascinating over the last few years is people coming forward who you on paper would say they don't have interest in coming out just to be on, I don't know, on some daytime talk show, right? If you look at former highly skilled, highly trained, very much cherry-picked people who are working for the military, for the Navy, people in political positions, and talking about UFOs and the not only the possibility, but the actual witnessing of what for them was an unidentified flying object at the time. So I'm very fascinated to see what we're going to make out of all of this in the next few years. Curiosity question: what is your take on the hypothesis of someone, he is not another esteemed guest on the podcast, Professor Avi Loeb, his first book a few years ago that was on Oumuamua. So if you're aware of his books, and what's your take on his hypothesis that this actually very well may have been a piece of extraterrestrial technology?
Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot to that, and there's been a bunch of papers that sort of pushed back. I know Professor Loeb and have respect his the previous work he's done, but I felt that like really what happened with Oumuamua was his sort of like clinging to something even after people who were experts in the field that he wasn't in, which is comets. The thing about the way science works is that you have a claim. So let's actually back up for the people. Should we give a little background about it? So it was amazing because it was the first time we had an interplanetary interloper, right? It was the first object that we clearly could tell was passing through, right? It was just passing through the solar system. It had come from another star system. And we always expected this because we know that comets and asteroids, which are rocks orbiting the sun, that they could be kicked out of the solar system pretty easily. So we always expected that at some point we were going to detect something passing through, but our technologies had finally reached that point. So we discover Oumuamua. We see this object traveling through the solar system at high speed, knowing it's not bound to the sun, it's going to pass. And Professor Loeb and a couple others wrote a paper saying, oh, we've analyzed it, and it could be this, that, and the other thing. Most people expect it to be a dead comet, the core of a comet, or maybe an asteroid. And at the bottom of their list, they put it could be an interstellar artifact, a piece of technology, which is possible, right? And we're going to be looking for those. But then the subsequent paper, and they were like, no, it absolutely is that. And they were looking at a couple of things that were anomalous, that like the path it was taking and such. And so we really bit down on that conclusion that it's an alien artifact, a sail, a light sail, as we call it. But then here's the thing, is that Professor Loeb is not an expert in comets, right? He hasn't spent his life studying comets. He spent his life studying black holes. And the people who study comets were like, no, here's the way we can explain the things that you're trying to explain that are much more likely as a comet. And then more and more evidence built up, more and more analysis was like, no, you don't need the extraordinary claim that it's an alien artifact. And right now we don't know whether there's alien artifacts. We definitely know there are comets. Right? And so in the end, from the people who actually studied comets, there was much more likely explanations for the stuff you wanted to explain that it was an interstellar comet, which is still amazing. But Professor Loeb has never really been willing to be like, okay, yeah, that's a better explanation. And in science, there's something called Occam's razor, which is if you have something you want to explain, the explanation that has the fewest number of assumptions is the one that wins. So we know comets exist. We expect comets to get kicked out of other planets, out of other planetary systems. There were many ways to explain this thing in terms of it being an extrasolar comet. And so that's the more likely explanation. So yeah, I think that Professor Loeb had stepped away from his own, what should have been his scientific objectivity of, okay, this is not my field. These other people know more than I do. I understand what they're saying. It's not. It's most likely. And again, all we can say most likely, because the thing whizzed by and we don't get any more observations. And we should be looking we've discovered, I think, one or two more of these interstellar interlopers. One of them could be at some point a piece of an artifact. But the evidence for this one was, no, it's not.
Thank you for your take on this, Adam. I certainly would like to play. I'm not sure if you have this expression in English. It means to play mouse when two or more people are having a discussion. I'd certainly like to play mouse if you and Ali ever have that discussion. Something that you actually talk about in your work, or your work suggests, is that understanding the life cycles of hypothetical exocivilizations could actually offer us critical insights into our own survival challenges. And what are some of the key lessons you believe we could draw from modeling the potential rise and fall of alien civilizations, particularly with regard to sustainability?
Yeah. What's interesting is we have, as I've said, like we've only recently become or developed a technosphere. That's maybe 100 years old or so. And almost as soon as we developed one, which is a world spanning, a world girdling technological civilization where there's so much of our technology out there that it's changing the planet. So very quickly, our technosphere started affecting the function of the Earth and its biosphere in ways that are going to be detrimental to us, right? So climate change and all the boundaries, the natural boundaries that we're crossing. As I always like to say, people are like, oh, we have to save the Earth. No, the Earth's going to be just fine. Thank you very much. We're going to push the Earth into a new climate state, and there's going to be changes, but that's happened many times before. We're the ones who are going to suffer because really this project of civilization that we've built, the Technosphere, where you can fly an airplane anywhere you want at any time. You have computer chips being manufactured in Singapore, which suddenly show up in your cell phone, on your pocket. That is pretty delicate. And the Technosphere can't handle much changes to the biosphere, which is what the Technosphere is changing the biosphere. So we have this question, as you said, of sustainability. The Technosphere we built is not sustainable. And unless we change course, who knows? We're going to get another 100 years before the thing could collapse. Human beings will always be here, but we're not going to be living in this kind of society. Yeah, so the idea would be that we explored in a set of papers was that any civilization that starts to develop a technosphere is harvesting so much energy from its environment that it's probably going to trigger something like climate change. That was our hypothesis. So that every civilization goes through the kind of phase that we're just going through right now. And then the question was, who makes it? And what does it take to make it? So we did a bunch of work on this. And what we found was that, because let me just back up for a second. The important question is we're trying to develop a sustainable version of our civilization, of our energy-intensive civilization. But how do we know that's even possible? How do we know that's something nature does? Maybe out in the entire universe, maybe there's lots of planets with life, but there's no technological civilizations that last more than 100 years. They wipe themselves out via climate change or nuclear war or whatever. So the first thing we wanted to see was, is it even possible for there to be a long-lived, like tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years of having a civilization like ours? And what we found was, yes, in our models, we modeled the planet and the civilization together about a third of the time. The other 2/3 of the time, So it's easy to kill yourself, but it's also possible to survive. And that really depends on the choices that you make. Now, our models were very simple, right? That's important to remember. But it really depends on the choices you make in terms of how you harvest energy. So right now we're using fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have a clear negative impact on the sustainability of the biosphere for the technosphere. And either we change or we don't. And then we're going to be in the cosmic dustbin of history.
And there's so many interesting discussions going on. Of course, I am not a scientist in that realm or a researcher in that realm, but talking about the possibilities of free energy and other things like that, where we actually would be able to tap into an infinite source that's all around us in some form versus being an extractive kind of like consumerist culture. Yeah. And if we look at the quest to understand our place in the cosmos and throughout human history, it has driven both our scientific inquiry, our philosophical contemplation. And as we explore further into space, do you think the fundamental questions about our existence have changed, or are we still grappling with the same old existential dilemmas?
I think the questions have changed. The more we learn, the way we ask the questions has changed. You may get the sense from talking to me that I am on the one, like when it comes to UFOs and everything, I'm a skeptic because I'm very much, show me the data, show me the analysis, right? And if the data and the analysis can't stand up to the kind of scrutiny that I'm going to be, like I were to go to my colleagues and be like, I have found evidence of a civilization with my telescopes, I'm going to get pardon my language, my ass kicked, right? As I should. They're going to look at every piece of data I've taken. They're going to look at how I took the data. They're going to look at how I did the analysis, what I did with the telescopes, the links between all the other ways I could be wrong, and they're going to skewer me. And that's important because in science, the only reason we have cell phones and antibiotics and airplanes is because that kind of meanness, we're really mean. Scientists are mean to each other. That meanness is in place. That is what ensures that the science works. And you can see it all around you. A cell phone would be a brick if it wasn't for, but he's right, exactly. So these technologies, the science only works because of that rigorous link between I want to make a claim for something, UFOs are alien spaceships, and the data I have for that claim. We are brutal about that, establishing that link. So you can see I'm very much in that camp, which is why Avi Loeb's claim about it doesn't hold up. It just doesn't hold up. But I am a heretic when it comes to what science shows us about the universe, right? There's a narrative about science which emerged from, we talked about the Copernican revolution, from the first wave of what we thought science told us about the world. And part of that narrative is we are only our atoms, right? You are nothing but, it's called reductionism. You are nothing but your neurons, and your neurons are nothing but their atoms, and their atoms are nothing but their quarks, blah, blah, blah. So therefore, you're basically just a meat computer. You are a machine made out of meat. And we just recently published a book, I and two colleagues, one another physicist, another philosopher, called The Blind Spot, Why Science Cannot Ignore Human Experience. Where what we're claiming is that science has progressed to the point where like that view doesn't make sense anymore. You are not a meat computer. Life is a much richer, more integrated, more holistic phenomena. Consciousness, experience is a much more rich, integrated, holistic phenomena than this kind of old idea that the world is just a dead machine. In that way, I think the questions, when you're asked, like, getting back to your original question, what has changed? I think we now can ask questions, scientific questions, in a way that keeps the rigor that we expect from science, but also broadens us past that idea that the science is the only way that human beings discover truths. And that in order for science to discover those truths, it has to reduce everything to like component parts. There's no way, I think we're beginning to understand how to think about complexity and complex wholes in a way that changes the nature of these debates.
Yes, and that's something I really appreciate about your work, Adam. You've often highlighted that science and spirituality are not mutually exclusive, but rather complementary in exploring the mysteries of our existence, the richness of life. And as you just said, the intersection of science doesn't look at things a certain way anymore. There's this intersection of science and spirituality. Something that I find really interesting as well is your focus on the study of consciousness through the lens of physics and information theory, which is a really fascinating intersection of mind and matter. What do you find most intriguing about the current scientific approaches to understanding consciousness, and where do you see this field heading?
Yeah, so as I said, I think the problem with the way we understand consciousness, and especially the way it gets expressed in the popular imagination, is again this meat computer idea. This idea that artificial intelligence shows us that one day you're going to be able to download yourself into a computer, and this is the simulation hypothesis. This idea that we're probably just a simulation. I'm like, I was on a radio show, and the guy said to me, "What do you think the odds are that we're in a simulation?" I was like, 0. And he just had some guy on who said it was 50%. I'm like,
so that's super interesting, because I think it's also, I'm not sure, but if you look at people like Elon Musk or so, there's people who one may assume they think we're living in a simulation. It's just, frig it all, I'm just gonna blow up stuff here and blow up stuff here, whatever. But you saying the likelihood of us being in a simulation is 0%. So why is that?
Because we have no idea whether you can simulate consciousness, right? That is a That's a metaphysics. That's not even a theory. That's like a philosophical position, right? Philosophically, I come from two traditions, right? I'm interested in two traditions. One is what's called phenomenology, which began in Europe, which is often associated with what they call continental philosophy because of the continent. Edmund Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, French philosopher. These were philosophers who suddenly realized that, wow, what we really don't engage with in Western philosophy is the verb to be, is the ongoingness of presence, of being present. Like we always want to project into this third person view of the world, the God's eye view, which comes along with science. That I can imagine myself floating as a disembodied perspective looking down on the world. But who gets that? Has anybody ever had a disembodied third person view? No.
Maybe not while sober. There
Yeah,
are,
right.
however, plant medicines.
Or depending on what mushrooms you took. Yeah. But actually, nobody's ever had a third person view. To actually engage in the world is always to be first person. And more than that, it actually requires second person as well, because I'm only me because I'm part of a community of language users. We're having a conversation because both of us are part of a community of language users. And that community of language users has a history. And that history is also embedded in ecosystems of life, going all the way back to the beginning of life, right? So the entire history of the biosphere is implicated in you and me having this conversation. So the idea that oh, I'm just a meat computer and that you can simulate this thing called experience. I really don't like the word consciousness because it reifies experience. It makes it into a thing like a box. Oh, I've got 2 units of consciousness in this box.
Yes. Ray Kurzweil used to do, basically.
I'm sorry, I missed that. Can you say it again?
Ray Kurzweil.
Yeah. Oh my God. Ray Kurzweil. I'm sorry, Ray, wherever you are, buddy. No way. Transhumanism, of which he is a religion. It's a religion that's cloaked in science. And so the philosophies of phenomenology, which really took the verb to be seriously, recognized there's only one way we encounter being, and that is as experience, as first person experience. And it sought to understand that in a way that didn't project off into this third person view, didn't reduce us to just neurons, and so gave us a much richer view. I'm also very interested and very close to the classical philosophies of India and Asia, some of which were Buddhist, that also took this question of experience as being fundamental. It really started with, what is it like to be an experiencer? And from those philosophies or metaphysics or whatever you want to call it, you can just get a different focus than what has happened with the Western line of philosophy and the science and the claims that it made for science, right? So what we call the blind spot in that book is not really not science. What's happening is there's this metaphysics, what we call the blind spot, which is like reductionism and of this idea of, we'll go on, that says this is what science says. It's a metaphysics that wants to speak for science, because science is just a method for talking to nature. And I think what we're arguing in the book, and what this idea of looking at experience from an information theory perspective gives you a different way of approaching this question, and you can still approach it scientifically, that doesn't reduce us to meat computers. That doesn't say, oh, of course I can project myself into a computer. That may fundamentally be impossible. And in fact, actually, there's no evidence right now that is possible. So the idea that we're in a simulation is just a philosophical game that people are playing, and then saying, oh, science shows us that's true. Science does not show us that's true. Not even close. I think that was a long-winded response. I don't know. We may have to come back to the information theory, but maybe there's something about that we want to unpack.
Yes, absolutely. And it resonates deeply with me. I have always personally had an issue with, to use your words, to think about ourselves as mere meat computers, and that we're just neurons and you can upload memories into some computer and then an avatar, and then that's basically you. Where does that actually leave consciousness, or things that we can't touch or we can't even explain as of yet, right? And exploring our consciousness, how do we navigate the challenges of the subjective experience within the framework of objective, or hopefully objective, science?
Yeah, because so objectivity can mean different things. And actually looking at the history of what objectivity meant in science is really interesting, because the view we get now of what objectivity is actually pretty modern. And that view we get is objectivity is that God's eye view. It's that sort of like third person perspectiveless perspective. There's a philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who called it the view from nowhere. right? Because it's a recognition that like no one's ever had this. This is not a view that any human being has ever had. That, I call that an objective ontology. So ontology is the branch of philosophy that deals with what exists. And if you can frame it as what's in God's living room, what stuff is in God's living room. And so objective ontology says, oh, science gives us a perspective, a view from nowhere on what truly actually exists, independent of us. And what we're coming from, or the perspective we're taking, is actually no one's ever had that. That's not what we mean by objective. That's not what science means by objective. What science means is you do the experiment, you get a result. I do the experiment, I get a result. We sit down and we talk to each other and we're like, whoa, we got the same result, right? That's objectivity. It's intersubjectivity. It's the fact that we recognize that we're living in a shared world, right? Not a world that like we can look at from outside. We are always each looking at it from our perspectives, but we are part of a community. That's a different kind of way of understanding objectivity. And it's from that you can begin to develop a science of experience. Again, I do not like the word consciousness because of the history. Experience is alive. Experience is wet. Experience is ongoing. That is what the verb to be is about. To develop a science of being an experiencer, being an agent, an autonomous agent in the world, that is where, with that view of objectivity, then we can begin to make some progress into those questions.
Mm. And when you're talking about experience and that it's ongoing, that also brings up in my mind another field that you have done quite some extensive work in. You also published a book about time. So we human beings have our experiences within the context of time. When we take reference to an experience, we place it at certain, if we like to look at time as something linear, most of us, right? So that's what we've been taught. And in your book about time, you actually delve into how our understanding of time has evolved from the ancient mythologies to the modern physics and how that has shaped our human culture. And how does our modern scientific conception of time influence the society that we're right now living in, and especially within the context of accelerating technological change?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things in that book was I was looking at how timekeeping technology shaped both culture, the actual culture you built, and your ideas about the universe, your fundamental ideas about what fundamentally exists. And it was fascinating to see how the invention of clocks in the 15th century reworked all of Europe and reworked how people literally, what they did each day, how you got up and what you thought you were supposed to do that day. If you didn't have clocks, then you got up when the sun rose and you went to bed when the sun set, and you ate when you were hungry, right? And it was only with the invention of clocks, first as bells being rung in the town square, that suddenly daily life got ordered. And then you got watches that had second hands. The second hand was a major invention. Oh, it's not just time for lunch. It's 10 minutes after the appointment I had for lunch. Now life's getting very rigorously broken up into units. And of course, now with digital, right, with digital technologies, we are breaking seconds down into trillions, millions, billions of a second, which is what these computers we're talking on work on. And that has had its an effect that all of us feel like we're just constantly, there's never enough time. And so our experience of time has been very much technologically mediated. The technology has created opportunities for the society to change, maybe not in good ways. And then individuals, we all have to respond. We all live in those worlds that then get built for us. But that's only one kind of time, right? There is anybody so I'm a Zen Buddhist. I practice Zen contemplative practice. So I've done 5-day sessions of sitting from 7 in the morning until 9 at night. And boy, that's a different experience of time. And I think there are ways we have experienced time in the past. There are ways we could experience time depending on what happens in the future. But I think it's important to recognize that the time we experience, and this idea of linear time, very much a construct of science. I believe actually it's possible that, and this is what I'm interested in, is we explore as we explore the question of what is experience. I'm just interested. I have no idea. But I'm interested in the idea that we're going to see a much closer, there's a different kind of time, not the sort of third person Einsteinian time that we think of when we do physics, but that also we're going to see there's a kind of biologically mediated time or organismal time, the time of the creaturely time that maybe actually in some weird way more fundamental. Because again, if there is no third person view, if experience is always your route to the world, experience, you can't do science unless you are already experiencing, then the time that is experience is actually more fundamental than any theoretical version you get of time, which would be Newtonian, what you get in theoretical physics and such.
The concept of time is also, as I mentioned at the very beginning of our discussion, something that's always profoundly interested me. And how looking at our concepts of time and the ways that our understanding of time has shifted over time, what are some ways that you think it has impacted human behavior and also our sense of legacy? You started out with also sharing with us when clocks were first invented and such. What are some other profound shifts? And again, how has it affected our behavior and our sense of legacy?
I think the worst way it's affected our behavior are these devices that we're never unplugged from, right? And so these devices are the product of having a particular kind of scientific time, which is quite powerful and quite useful. And what is the clock cycle on your CPU? It's billionths of a second, if not less. And so that enables these devices. And from these devices, we've built a world where none of us are disconnected, where we are completely connected all the time. And there's been good things about that. But in terms of our personal lives, there's also been devastating things about our lives, what it means to be human in the 21st century. So in that way, I think it's been it's a problem that we're going to have to work out. Like I said, these technologies have good things about them, but it may be in the end that they actually overwhelm us. You look at how these technologies have done things like social media, which is basically undermining democratic self-governance across the world, right? You can see, oh, wow, these technologies actually may have very detrimental effects on us, both personally and our ability to manifest thriving human communities. That is an open question about this new vision of time, this new way of manipulating time. This way of seeing time only in this one way could be quite potent and dangerous. And again, when you think about legacy, we have a legacy. Like if we're going to make it to the 23rd century, I think we're probably going to have to come to some different understandings of these and different relationships to these technologies.
Yes, indeed, Adam. And to be respectful of your time, and I know we're running out of time, I only have a couple more questions. I have so many more questions, but I have a couple more if it's okay that I'd love to ask you because they're relevant. We just discussed. And one thing is the impact of science. You've been a consultant for popular media like Marvel's Doctor Strange, by the way, one of my favorite movies ever. I've watched it. And you've helped in this way also shape the public's understanding of complex scientific ideas, also via your books and podcasts like this one you're on. How do you see the role of science in popular culture evolving, and what impact does this have on the public engagement with scientific issues?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely essential that scientists talk to the public. One of the most amazing things is nobody knows scientists, right? So I saw nobody has any personal contact with scientists, right? So the public's understanding of science is skewed, right? And we've seen a huge decline in the faith or whatever, the respect, that's the wrong word I'm using, but whether or not people believe science. We have a huge problem with science denial in the world. And that really is going to cause problems because you can't have a scientific society where people think that science, the parts of science that their particular political belief,
religious flavor,
that's a hoax. That part's a hoax. Oh, give me the antibiotics, but climate change is a hoax. No, sorry, it doesn't work that way. Science is not a buffet that you get to choose from what you want to believe. So most people, and I've seen most people, their vision of scientists comes from, what is the show? Now suddenly I'm having a brain fart.
Bill Nye?
Bill Nye, but Bill Nye at least is doing the work. No, what's the show with the physicists? It was on for years. Oh my God. It was a comedy.
Oh, Big Bang Theory?
Big Bang Theory, right? That's the way people think physicists or scientists are, which is really important for seeing that scientists are just like everybody else. Yeah, nerdy for sure. But that like people need to understand that science comes from human beings doing science. Because if we have to get past the science denial that's happening, sciences are the best shot we have for being able to make intelligent decisions about self-governance in the world. So I think it's really important. And what's great is, for me, I was inspired by Carl Sagan. When Carl Sagan was writing his stuff, he was the only guy doing it. So my generation, I'm 62 now, my generation, there's a lot more of us, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, there's Bill Nye, there's a lot more science popularizers. The younger generation is amazing. They're YouTube videos, they're deploying the full TikTok, the full range of possibilities for communicating science with people. So that's great. And it's essential. And there's two parts of it. One is to teach people how science works. How does science come to its conclusions? The other part is to show people it's beautiful, right? I went into science because the world is extraordinary. And every time I learn more about it, it renews for me the sense of sacredness, for lack of a better word. Just that the world is incredible and that there's more than just meets the eye. Yeah, so I think it's critical that there is popular science communication and lots more of it.
Yes, indeed. And also the great balance of being informative as well as entertaining, especially for the broader masses who may not be willing or able to listen to or read to and dissect something that's drier. Something as the last question to this incredible conversation. Thank you so much, Adam. Our discussions on planetary stewardship, they emphasize that our technological advancements come with significant responsibilities for the future result, for the future of the human family. And I'd like to know from you, what steps do you believe are essential for humanity to take in the next century to ensure a sustainable coexistence with our planet?
There's two votes you can make that matter most. The first vote is your vote. Right? It is actually voting. So if you're lucky enough to be in a country that has a still functioning democracy, vote early, vote often, which is that's a joke from Chicago. Where, you can vote a few times. No, what I mean by that is when I traveled around, obviously American democracy is under a threat. Obviously, that's my view, but I think it's an objective view. And there's lots of ways to vote, right? There's voting in once a year elections, but there's democracy happening all over the place. You got a town you're probably living in, join the water board, be part of, get involved in your community in whichever way you can, because there's 1,000 decisions. If you want to say, for climate change is not just the UN getting together and making some kind of decision. It's 1,000 little decisions about, in your town, what are they going to do about their water treatment? What kind of lights are they going to put in? That decision is just as important as the UN making its decisions. The other vote that you can make is where you spend your money. It's your dollar. Every dollar you spend is a vote you're making on what you're going to build, what kind of society you want. So be careful about what you build. Obviously, things are complex. Do not get into this thing where you're a horrible person because you bought a plastic water bottle once because there was no other options, right? Be reasonable, be kind to yourself, but just as much as possible, make good decisions that lead us to a sustainable society. And finally, be nice to people. That's the most important thing. Just be kind, right? Just be aware. Every human being, whether they're of your political persuasion or not or whatever, has got their own problems, is living in their own chaos. Be kind to people, be kind to yourself. And that's the best you can do. And it's a big universe that's got its own ways. And we're here, we got to take care of each other and do our best. But
I concur 100%, Adam, and great closing words. Lastly, people who want to learn more about you and maybe even connect with you, where can they find you?
Let's see, Twitter. I'm still on Twitter. We'll see how long that's going to be, which is Adam Frank 4. Facebook, you can just go look for my Facebook author page. So yeah, those are the two places that are probably the easiest place to communicate with me.
Outstanding. And of course, I'll put links for all of that in the show notes. Adam, what a pleasure. I absolutely loved conversing with you. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much. This was really a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.